Hey guys, welcome to week two's class on Portrait of Jason. I hope that you're all doing well. I hope that the introduction video made sense. Thanks a lot to everyone who sent me their work for week one. As I say, it's not obligatory. There will be a written component of the examination for the course, but I'll post some more details for that within the next couple of weeks, and you don't need to worry about it now, okay? So the most important thing is that you just engage with the material that I'm giving you, and that you watch the classes and you keep up with the course as best as you can, okay? As always, if you're having trouble accessing anything, if you're having trouble understanding, or if you just want to talk about any of the material, then please feel free to write to me. Okay, but on with the class for today. So, Portrait of Jason by Shirley Clarke, released and filmed in 1967. So, we'll just start with a bit of background to the film, okay? Here we see a kind of contemporary poster, which I think is we can talk about this a little bit because I think it's revealing. I think, first of all, the film is marketed as being unlike anything you have ever seen. So it's immediately suggesting that there is some kind of content in the film which is being presented to an audience, to a cinema going audience for the first time. So they are going to see something, specifically someone or a type of person that they have not seen before, and that this um, is a selling point of the film. The film is presenting something which is unique, and which the kind of people who would go to see a film at somewhere in the world will never have seen before. And that may be because of the way that the film is shot, or it may be because of the subject matter of the film, or it may be a combination of both. But the idea that the film itself was marketed based on a kind of singularity, or based on the sense that it was offering something that we've never seen, is something which I think is interesting, and is worth dwelling on when we think about, as we will do with all of the things that we're engaging with on the course, when we think about what it is that that the film is telling us about the histories and the historical context which are going into making it, and what it is about this film, or what this film expresses about its kind of historical cultural moment, and what it meant to be queer, and what it meant to make a film about a queer person in 1967, and not just a queer person, but an African American queer person too. And yeah, this is something that the film itself is claiming that its audience, or at least the marketers of the film, are claiming that their audience would not have seen. So yeah, just some basic information. It's the third feature film that Shirley Clarke made. She made some shorts before that. After The Connection in 1961, and sorry, it's a typo on the thing, and after Cool World, which came out in 1967. I do proofread my PowerPoints, but sometimes some things slip through, so forgive me. So yeah, and it follows in the tradition of what's known as cinema verite, which is called cinema verite because it started in France, which is the idea that you can use film to kind of capture real life in some way, and that if you film, it's possible for a director to use the camera to really show something true and something non-fictional. Which is an idea which was very influential in the French film, for example, Chronicle of a Summer, um, but is also something which is quite questionable because people behave differently when they have a camera on them, and there's always an editing process involved. Um, which can change the meaning of what is happening in front of the camera very dramatically, actually, even though there is no script and even though a person is ostensibly so if something is ostensible or if someone is doing something ostensibly, they are it means that you are essentially supposed to be. So if something is ostensibly non-fiction, something that is supposed to be non-fiction, but perhaps is not. And it's an adjective. So if we say that cinema verite was ostensibly showing us reality in some way without a kind of editorial control, we're suggesting that maybe there's something more complicated going on when we see and hear film which is in this tradition. And this is a tradition, and we'll talk about this as we go through the class, that Shirley Clarke was very critical of. She didn't really believe that you could capture reality with an unmediated camera, or she didn't really believe that you could capture what we would call unmediated pure reality with a camera. She thought there was always some kind of directorial control going on, and her two previous films, The Connection and The Cool World, were examples of this, were examples of attempts to critique cinema verite while also taking some things from it. And it was very popular with American filmmakers, especially avant-garde independent filmmakers at the time that Shirley Clarke was making her movies. So her portrait of Jason in some ways is also very much in this tradition of being influenced by cinema verite, but also having a kind of critical approach to it. And we'll see the way in which this works as we go through the class and we watch some clips from the film. And yeah, the movie was shot in New York's Chelsea Hotel, where Clarke was staying at the time. Chelsea Hotel is a very famous spot in Manhattan. It featured in a number of songs. Leonard Cohen has a song called Chelsea Hotel. And Bob Dylan mentions Chelsea Hotel at one point in his songs. It's a famous kind of artistic hangout. But it's also not an especially cheap place to stay. And something that we'll talk about is the ways in which the fact that this is in a hotel, it means different things for Jason Holiday, the subject of the film, and for Shirley Clarke, who is the director. But I want to flag that up right away. Hotels are funny spaces, and they're spaces which people with different occupations and different classes or from different classes might relate to very differently when they inhabit them. And it features Jason Holiday, who calls himself a hustler. He never refers to himself as a sex worker, but we know that that's what he's been doing for part of his life at least. And he reflects on his life and he tells a series of stories. He performs some of his nightclub act. He gets increasingly drunk. And at the end of the film, he kind of breaks down, but then appears to recover fairly easily, or fairly quickly, and says he's happy with the whole thing. It was well received. If you read contemporary reviews of it, people thought it was very interesting. More recently, there's still a fairly decent amount of critical writing on Portrait of Jason. It's a well-known independent film. Shirley Clarke's most famous film by a long way. But it's also been criticized for fairly obvious reasons, which is that on the one hand, Jason appears to have a lot of agency in the movie, but on the other hand, this is a film made by a wealthy white woman. Shirley Clarke came from a significant amount of money. Her family had a lot of money, and she was able to be an artist and to make films because of this. And she was a heterosexual white woman who if we read the film in one way, is essentially exploiting much more working class African American queer man in order to make something interesting, in order to make something unlike anything that anyone has ever seen. So there is a kind of contradiction expressed in the relationship between Clark and Holiday, and in both of their relationships to the film itself that they're making. In the essay Reflection on Portrait of Jason, or what's it called? Sorry, forgotten what it's called. Reconsidering Portrait of Jason, that I uploaded to eCampus. You also read that Holiday had kind of hoped the film would provide him with a launch pad or with an entrance into having the nightclub career that he said that he wanted, which it didn't. He never disowned it. He would attend screenings of the film, as I say here. He would kind of, he would introduce it. Like, it seemed as if he was happy to be associated with it. But it never provided him with what he had hoped it would provide him with, which is sufficient fame to be able to pursue his career as a nightclub performer. So yeah, Clark and Jason obviously had different relationships to the space in which the film was shot. They had different relationships to what they wanted from the film. And one of them, Clark, got what she wanted, which is the film Portrait of Jason. Jason seemed not to. Jason Holiday seemed not to get exactly what he wanted from the film. He wasn't able to use it in the way that he hoped that he'd been able to use it. And yeah, the final point that I want to stress, and that I'll stress throughout the course, is that I'm not personally, or I don't personally think it's the most interesting thing that one can do to make moral judgments about a cultural object, for example. I could understand why people do that, and I think at points perhaps it's important to consider the moral status of a cultural object. But it's also important to see how a film, even when it's something that perhaps we do not like, or perhaps that we would not want to see made again, even then it will express some important facts about the social world in which it was made, and it will tell us something about the way in which society was structured. And on this course, it will tell us something about what being queer meant at the time that each of either the text or the films that we're looking at were constructed. It might not always be obvious, and it might mean sometimes reading films almost against themselves, or reading them in a way which perhaps they didn't intend to be read. But nonetheless, each of the texts will provide us with the opportunity to see what they express about the society and the history that they take part in. And I am personally more interested in that than in assigning moral responsibility to Shirley Clark, for example. It is worth remembering at this point, though, that one of the things that we covered last week, one of the things that Hugh Lemmy and Ben Miller say, when, as two white homosexual queer writers interested in, salvaging and doing something new with the history of homosexuality, one of the things that they say is that one of the reasons why mainstream homosexuality has failed as an emancipatory project is because it has traditionally instrumentalized and taken advantage of, in some way, the bodies and the lives and the histories of racialized people and of people of color. So Shirley Clark, I don't think, thought of herself as making a queer film, and I'm not convinced that Portrait of Jason is a queer film. But it is something that tells us about what being queer means, or what being queer meant for certain people in 1967. And part of that is, is undeniably involved with race and how we understand Holiday as being appropriated by the film that he's in, or how we understand him as using the film as a way to express his own agency and using the film as a way to affirm his own life, which is something that he does at numerous points throughout the film. So I don't think that we necessarily come down on one side or the other of this question, but it's something that we would almost certainly want to bear in mind. So to bear in mind, I'm sure most of you guys probably know this already, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. But to bear in mind is to think about something, like, to keep it in mind, so yeah, we want to bear this question in mind as we go through. Okay, and little detour, we are going to watch clips from the film throughout this class, but something that I want to focus on to start with is not related to Portrait of Jason, or was not written about Portrait of Jason, but something that we're going to encounter throughout the, and that we've already encountered throughout the course, is the relationship between being queer, between what being queer means and the forms that it takes in society, and this question of property. And what I mean by property is literally owning things, especially owning houses and owning land and objects and money, but especially houses and land. And this is something that we've already seen in Lemmy and Miller, when they suggest that one of the primary drives of, again, what they call mainstream homosexuality, mainstream queer identity, has been to integrate into a social world, to marry, and to acquire property. And one of the things about marriage is that it allows you to pass on property after you die. That's one of the big things about marriage, and it always has been from kind of feudal times up until now. One of the reasons, often for good reasons, but one of the reasons why people get married is because they want their partner to be able to inherit things that they own in the event of their death. And that's one of the big reasons for gay marriage, is that it enables that kind of property relation to take place. It enables homosexual people to be able to pass on their property unambiguously to someone that they love in the event that they die. And in lots of ways, we might say, great. We might say that's a good thing. I'm certainly not saying it's not a good thing. However, we can see how questions over integration and questions over assimilation, like the ones that Lemmy and Miller raise, and which are raised in all kinds of like radical or more or less radical critiques and understandings of kind of what's happened to homosexual identity over the last kind of 20 or 30 years, they all revolve more or less around this question of property. And as we go through the course, we'll see how being queer is consistently defined, maybe not defined, but how being queer, the ways in which being queer manifests itself. So the ways in which being queer, or what being queer means, and the ways in which people who are queer live, has a lot to do with this question of who owns property, who does not own property, and why they do or do not own property. And we'll be looking at this throughout the course in almost each of the texts that we'll be looking at. And again, the idea of the hotel is going to come up next week too, because the poems that we'll be reading called the Hotel Wentley Poems by John Wieners, and they're called the Hotel Wentley Poems because they were written in the Hotel Wentley, which is in San Francisco. So I'll start with this long quotation from John David Rhodes, who is a queer theorist and a film theorist, who His most recent book is called Spectacle of Property: The House in American Film. If anyone can get hold of it, I would recommend it. If you can't get hold of it, then write to me and I can see if I can send you an electronic copy of it. It's interesting if you're interested in American cinema. And the book is not specifically a book of queer theory, but Rhodes is a queer theorist. I think he would define himself as a queer theorist. He's a gay man who writes on film and queer theory. He's a very astute analyst of cinema, especially. But he has this to say about the relationship between film and race, essentially, within the context of America. And obviously, within the context of America, we have to understand race in relation to the history of slavery. And you can't really understand the history of slavery without understanding the fact that human beings within slavery were treated as property. And at the same time as human beings within slavery being treated as property, we also get the fact that a lot of the property in the US, a lot of the wealth, a lot of the money which has bought property in the US has a very strong connection to the slave trade. The money that is washing around in the 19th century and still to this day has a pretty much direct relationship to slavery. And within the early 20th century, these connections to racial exclusion in the film industry continue. And in this book, Rhodes maps out the ways in which the ongoing history of racism in the US is very connected to the film industry, often not in really obvious ways, often in ways that you don't see unless you were really looking for it, unless you were investigating it. But I wanted to start with this quotation and then we'll elaborate it a little bit in relation to Portrait of Jason. So Rhodes says, because of the way in which the history of filmmaking in the United States is consubstantial with the racism that is at the heart of the nation's history and legal foundations. So consubstantial, I don't know if there's a similar French word, but it just means happening at the same time. Happening at the same time and existing in the same space. It's actually a theological term used to describe the Lutheran approach to the Holy Communion in Christianity, but we don't need to dwell on that too much. But it's happening in the same place and at the same time. With the racism that is at the heart of the nation's history and legal foundations, when we look at cinematic images, we are only rarely looking at black bodies. So again, we can relate this back to this idea that Portrait of Jason, is showing us something that no one has ever seen, unlike anything you have ever seen. It's rare to have a film which is just about one person being interviewed, and it would be especially rare to have a film about African American person being interviewed, and it has literally never been seen to have a film about an African queer person being interviewed. African American queer person being interviewed. So Rhodes is saying we don't often see black bodies when we look at the history of American cinema, but because when we look at cinematic images, we are always looking at black bodies. Sorry, I don't know why there's a comma there. Because when we look at the cinematic images, we are always looking at property. So we're always looking at things that people own in terms of props or sets, the property of a movie studio. We are, in a sense, always looking at black bodies. So we're always looking at the history of racism, which is bound up with. So if something is bound up with, it's intertwined. It's inseparably connected. So the history of racism is bound up with the history of property in the US in a very tangible way. So he says in some way, when we look at property, we're always looking at what Rhodes describes as black bodies. So as African American people who 100 years ago, 100 years from the making of Portrait of Jason, could have been treated as slavery. The Civil War ended almost exactly 100 years before Portrait of Jason is made, which is not a very long time. Invisibly and yet materially there, even when, as is so often the case, they are nowhere in sight. So we can say that Rhodes is arguing that kind of the specter of racism haunts American cinema through this fact of property, through the fact that ownership and wealth is so bound up with the history of slavery and racism in the US. And again, I want to take this thought and I want to think about it in relation to how queerness is determined and what it means in relation to most of the texts we're going to be looking at, but we can start by thinking about it in relation to Portrait of Jason. And something which is, we'll move on to that slide in a minute, something which we can, one way in which we can start this thought is this fact, simple fact, that Portrait of Jason is taking place in a hotel room. And it's a hotel room that Shirley Clarke is staying in because she is a wealthy individual who can afford to stay at the Chelsea Hotel. And who can afford to rent a room at the Chelsea Hotel in order to shoot a film there. Jason Holiday has a very different relationship to the Chelsea Hotel and to the hotel room in general, in the sense that it's probably not somewhere that he would have stayed in Manhattan, and it's also somewhere where he may have frequented, but frequented as a sex worker. So as someone who would meet people in hotels in order to provide them with the service that he provided them with for money. So right at the start of the film, or even before we even start the film, within the space of the film itself, we have this contradiction between how Holiday is likely to be relating to the space of the hotel and how Clarke is relating to the space of the hotel. And they are both, that contradiction is grounded in property, and we'll see the way in which that, as Jason tells his story, we'll see the way in which being a black working class queer man without access to property, so without owning property, the way in which that determines his life. And I think throughout the film, and throughout, as I keep saying, other texts that we will look at, the fact of not having property provides a particular framework through which Jason experiences what it means to be queer, and also through which Jason's queerness kind of manifests itself. And this is not always, and a lot of the time, this is not a question of positing him as a victim, but also something which nonetheless kind of defines his existence to some way or another, and it defines what it means to be queer in a larger context too. And we'll talk about that more in relation to other films as well. Okay, so we're going to get on to watching some clips from the movie pretty soon, but now, having identified what I think is one of the central contradictions within the space of the film that we see itself, and within who's behind the camera and who's in front of the camera, Clarke herself, and I think that, again, this is important, as we said before, she was very critical of Cinema Verite, and in an interview, which is cited in the smaller review, which I'll put on eCampus 2 of the film, she said there is no difference between a traditional fiction film and a documentary. I've never made a documentary. There is no such trip, meaning, in this context, there is no such trip just means there is no such thing. There is no such thing. It does not exist. So yeah, and Clarke is insistent about this. So again, something that we think about, and I think something that the film wants us to think about, and certainly as critical readers of the film, something that we should think about, is the way in which the editing that goes on in the film is creating meaning and is creating a kind of narrative, and is also representative of a kind of creative control on the part of Clarke, um, even though Holiday is the one who's doing all the talking. So we're going to look at some of the clips of the ways in which Holiday, what he says is, the meaning that gets attached to it is often a result of the kind of shot that Clarke is using, and also of the focus too. So the first question, then, moving on from that I think the film immediately asks us, or I might immediately pose, or that we might think about, is how much Portrait of Jason is an example of an opportunity which is given to Jason Holiday to essentially to create himself and to create an identity, which may or may not have existed. We don't hear any evidence that Jason is who he says he is. We assume that he is, and I don't think the film wants us to assume that the whole thing is made up. But at the same time, I feel as if it also it's as much about watching Jason tell his stories in the present and make a self as it is about the ways in which, or as it is about about the past, about the events that Jason himself narrates, or the content of the stories that he tells. And again, this quote from the long piece that I put on eCampus, which I think kind of gets to this point. The nonfiction camera does not simply document its subject, Clarke suggests. Rather, the camera's presence and the presence of the filmmaker provides the frame within and against which the documentary subject even actualizes himself, against which the documentary subject performs, even actualizes himself. So, by actualize, we mean make something real. Actualize literally means to make something real, to make an idea real. I'm sure it's similar in French, to make an idea real. But it also means to become a full person, to become a properly functioning person. So in some way, and I think all of this is contained in this idea that Holiday actualizes himself in the film. So he may make an idea of Jason Holiday real and fleshed out. He may actualize it. And it also may be an opportunity for him to become a healthier person, even though that doesn't really appear to happen within the film itself. But there's certainly, we can talk about there being an idea of Jason Holiday which is actualized in the space of the film and in the space of the interview that Clarke films and that Clarke gave Holiday. And I think that the film very obviously seeks to emphasize this idea that there is an element of creation going on in Jason's narrative. And we'll watch the first opening few minutes, and I think that we'll see this. Okay.
Miss Shirley Clarke, Portrait of Jason, roll one, sound one.
Okay, roll it.
Sound rolling. Camera rolling.
Okay, Jason, go.
My name is Jason Holiday. My name is Jason Holiday. My name is Aaron Payne.
What do you mean, Aaron Payne?
Aaron Payne. That was my given name. Francisco, I got hung up with a group of people that were under the influence of Sabu. He was changing people's names to suit their personalities. And I changed my name. Jason Holiday was created in San Francisco. And San Francisco is a place to be created, believe me.
You like the name Aaron Payne?
As Aaron Payne, I was pretty far out.
So this is the opening minute of the film, and we can already see the extent to which Clarke is using techniques which give a kind of metaphorical meaning to the words that Holiday is saying. She brings him in and out of focus as if, or I think in a way which, fairly clearly reflects the sense of being created, of passing from a state in which one could be one thing or another thing into becoming something fixed. So if you watch it again,
Miss Shirley Clarke, portrait of Jason, roll one, sound one.
Okay, roll it.
Sound rolling. Camera rolling.
Okay, Jason, go.
My name is Jason Holiday. My name is Jason Holiday. My name is Aaron Payne.
What do you mean?
and then again, so we start with a coming into focus as we see his face, and then Jason says his name is Jason Holiday, and he says it twice, and then he says his name is Aaron Payne, and then Clarke takes the camera out of focus and proceeds to film Jason talking about the process in which he was renamed, he says, by someone that he met in San Francisco, and he says San Francisco is a place to be created, and we'll talk about San Francisco next week as well, and its relationship to queer history in America, or its relationship to queer history on a global scale. But this adds a kind of metaphorical visual content to the words that Holiday is saying. It adds this sense of creation. We take something which is not clear, which is perhaps in the process of being created, and then we bring it into sharpness once, in some sense, the process of creation is finished. So we'll just watch this bit again.
Aaron Payne. That was my given name. And in San Francisco, I got hung up with a group of people that were under the influence of Sabu. He was changing people's names to suit their personalities. And I changed my name. Jason Holiday was created in San Francisco. And San Francisco is a place to be created, believe me.
You like the name Aaron Payne?
As Aaron Payne,
And it's also significant that we cut. So again, Clarke is creating a kind of step in the story. She's creating a kind of break and a natural progression within the narrative that Holiday and that Jason is telling. And she's doing that with the camera, and it's adding a kind of, it's not fictional, but it's clearly the result of directorial influence and intervention, and it's being used to add certain layers of meaning or certain metaphors to the story that Jason is saying.
I was pretty far out. Not any further than I am now, but I was, it had unpleasant memories that lead to this state of depression. And I just thought being with those people in San Francisco who personalities were suiting their names, that if I found myself another name and give myself another chance, I'd be happier. And I dug being called Jason. And like all my hip friends and the people that I knew, I told them my name is Jason now. And they call me that. But a few evil people, you know, every now and then they'll call you Aaron. And I remember once in San Francisco, I told Miles Davis, I said, my name is Jason. And Miles said, shit, that ain't none of your name. But he was hip enough to call me Jason. He hasn't called me Aaron since.
I think something that's interesting about this shot and that runs throughout the film is that we see how the camera frames Jason. We see him within a particular state of composition, which is quite delicate and which has obviously been thought about by Clark. It's kind of a nice photograph. But we also see that he's holding a newspaper that we know that he's not reading. And we also see him trying to project a certain image of himself. And I think in some way trying to look kind of intellectual or trying to look kind of upstanding. He's sitting up straight. He's reading a newspaper. I don't actually know what that newspaper... Oh, he's reading the East Village. The East Village is Greenwich Village, so it's an area of Manhattan. He's reading this kind of local newspaper, which appears to have a review of maybe The Wizard of Oz at the bottom of it. I've never actually noticed what that paper was. I'm sure that there's a reason behind it. But he's holding it in a way which is very mannered and which is clearly trying to project a certain idea of himself at the same time as he's talking about this moment in which he was able to, in which he decided to change his name in order to reinvent himself and to give him something new and to be a different person in some way. And again, if we go back to Butler from last week, we can think about the ways in which surface level behaviors, like having a name, like saying that your name is something, it's always an action that you do. It's always something that happens to you externally. So he says he dug being called Jason, and he said he calls the people who would refuse to call him Jason and would still call him Aaron, he calls them evil. He says that these people are people who, you know, in contemporary parlance, we would call it dead naming. When you refer to someone by a previous name after they have kind of given themselves a different name. And within the history of queer life that we're looking at, it's perhaps significant that Jason has not transitioned. He has not changed his gender, but he has changed his name, and he is physically affected almost by being referred to by his old name. And it's now as if Jason is expressive of a self. Jason, he is not Aaron Payne, he is Jason Holiday. But at the same time, these are surface level interactions. These are interactions that are happening out in the world. Someone calls him something and he feels hurt by it, or he enjoys being referred to by the name Jason. He feels that suits him and that is reflective of who he is as a person. And again, the reason that I'm stressing this is because I feel like it goes back to what Butler is suggesting about the fact that internal selves are more to do with what we do and what we say and what is done to us on the outside, then the outside is a reflection of a kind of essential, stable internal core. And we can see this dichotomy working in Jason at the same time as we can see him himself performing a series of mannerisms which seem to be intended to project a certain image. And as the film goes through, or as the film as we go through the film, we see that he gets more and more drunk, and that these mannerisms, they change. They never disappear completely, but they certainly change. And towards the start, he defines himself as someone who does not enjoy people who have too fixed of an idea of themselves. And I think that this is quite a significant moment that we'll watch now.
You're hung up, and everybody wants what isn't good for them, or what the grass is always greener, And me, I guess I'm a male bitch, because I go out of my way to unglue people, the ones that I think that have tendencies that might make it or fake it. Oh, I come on to them strong.
Okay, cut.
I cut already. Rolling.
Could you give me a drink, please?
So he describes himself as someone who likes to unglue people, who likes to unpick the self that people perhaps have created or that has been created for them, and to, in some way or another, maybe to sabotage it, to make it come undone, in a way which is seemingly reflective of his own sense that he had been created and has created himself within the context of San Francisco, of the queer community in San Francisco. And again, we see, I think, throughout this film, something that I'll emphasize is that there is it's cinema verite, or it's even a quality of the Nouvelle Vague, of the New Wave in France, not to try and hide the technical aspects of filmmaking within the finished product. So we see the way in which at the end of this scene, the film reel runs out and it cuts to black because there's no more film in the camera. But Clark and her camera assistant keep talking. And she leaves that in the film, so we'll watch it again.
I'm strong.
Okay, cut.
I cut already.
But at the same time, so in some ways...
Rolling.
Could you give me a drink, please?
Let's just get it back.
Could you give me a drink, please? Thank you.
So the cut there is a reflection of the fact that the film has run out. But at the same time, it also punctuates the narrative, and it emphasizes this quality that Jason has expressed about himself, which is his capacity to unglue people, to make people come undone, to kind of poke holes in the selves that they have established for themselves in a way. And again, we can think about this in relation to gender. We could think about it in relation to sexuality. Jason posits himself as a kind of trickster who is able to, or who wants to, if he's confronted with someone who is too sure of who they are, or who positions himself too rigidly as being one thing rather than another, he wants to unpick that. He wants to unglue it. He wants to make people like that come undone. And the way that the editing works in the film is that this is emphasized. And again, there's a quote from Clark, which I'll go to now, where she says, the PowerPoint is divided, just to say, the PowerPoint is divided into kind of a few main points, but they're more or less interchangeable. They all work together, and we'll talk about them together as we talk about the film. But she says her theory of cinema, or her theory of cinema verite, is that you don't take out the boring parts. Jason is 2 hours of real time, not film time. The film took 12 hours to make because we had to stop every 10 minutes to load the cameras. So what she means by that is that It's not actually 2 hours. It's an hour and 45 minutes or so, an hour and 48 minutes, I think. But it's close enough to 2 hours. All of that film is, all of that time that we see on the film is in some way unedited. So it's not, there's no time jumps within the film that was recorded. However, the film took 12 hours because after every 10 minutes of shooting, they had to reload the cameras. Holiday would have a break, which is why we see him getting so drunk as the film progresses, because he's been getting drunk in the hotel room for 12 hours by the end. But within the course of what is actually filmed, we see him, we only see him for 2 hours. However, there's something about the way that the film is structured, and about the way that Clarke includes the breaks in footage, includes the blank screen, includes the bringing him into focus at the start of a shot, which we see here when he's asking for a drink.
Wow. You know, sometimes
all of that adds a kind of layer of meaning and a kind of sense of metaphor in some way to what it is that Jason is doing, what it is that he's saying. And when I mean metaphor, when I say metaphor, what I mean is we see him asking for a drink. Can I have a drink, please? Can I have a drink, please? And the camera is not focused. Which immediately, in some ways, to me at least anyway, speaks to a sense that maybe Jason's drinking is something which is interfering with his personality, which is making him less clear. And even if that isn't what it suggests, it's that meaning presents itself as being possible because of the way that Clarke is filming, because of the shots that she's using, even though she would say it's just real time, it's just the way that we set up the film. So again, we see this kind of contradiction between Holiday's agency and the fact that he's just being filmed, and the kind of objective limitations of the film itself, and the ways in which Clarke seems to use those limitations to actually construct a kind of narrative, and to construct a kind of metaphorical, almost fictional meaning to what's going on, which is something that I think that she's aware of doing. Okay, so I'll talk about, okay, I'll analyze that quotation in a second. I think if we move on to this idea of performativity and its relationship to the economy, which is something that we can also add in race to this too. Performativity, the economy, and race. All three of these are working together within the film. And they're working together both within the space in which the film is shot, the hotel room, as I said, the two different positions of Clarke and of Jason in terms of economic relations, who has more wealth and who is from what class, determine the ways in which they relate to the space in which they're both in. And it also clearly relates to the kinds of stories that Jason tells about his life. We hear around 50 minutes into the film, we hear that Jason, first of all, we hear him talking about how much he hates the 9-to-5. We hear him saying that he does not want to do a kind of normal job, and that as a result of that, he wants to hustle, which means that you just make money any way that you can. And actually, we'll go back a bit. We hear him saying that he got a job as a houseboy, which is a servant, basically like a butler, who would live in the house and who would do jobs for wealthier white people.
You know, sometimes when you get uptight, you have to have a way to really function, when you don't want to go and punch a clock from 9 to 5. You have to have some kind of gimmick, something that you do. And I got hung up being a houseboy. And I have enjoyed it quite a bit. I've worked for a lot of fabulous people, which they think it's a joke. I didn't know one thing from the other from being a houseboy. I got a book from the library, and I found out, how much wrong can you do, and I can cook a little bit, and I can do a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And once you get involved with people that, that after they get to dig you, you can cover up for a lot of things that you don't do. They'll tolerate for the satisfaction. That's that little extra you give them. And I was working in San Francisco for a very rich woman up on Nob Hill, who was a riot. This woman was a camp. And she had an alcoholic husband. She had one husband she had buried.
So we have to move a little bit quicker, actually, because we're running out of time for the class. But what I want to draw attention to in that is the extent to which the kind of performances that Jason does are... they're determined by his economic position, and by his race. He's able to be a kind of to be essentially a butler or a servant for wealthy white people, and doing that involves a significant degree of performance. It involves doing things that he doesn't really know how to do, but he's able to convince people that he knows how to do.
You don't want to go and punch a clock from 9 to 5. You have to have some kind of gimmick, something that you do. And I got hung up being a houseboy. And I have enjoyed it quite a bit. I've worked for a lot of fabulous people, which they think it's a joke. I didn't know one thing from the other from being a houseboy. I got a book from the library, and I found out, how much wrong can you do, and I can cook a little bit, and I can do a little bit of this and a little bit of that.
So we hear that he didn't know, quote unquote, one thing from the other. So it means, he didn't know anything. Didn't know one thing from the other about being a houseboy. So he didn't know anything about it. But he was able to perform the role. He was able to sorry, I don't like that. He was able to convince people that he could succeed at being a houseboy, because he was kind of charming, because he could do a few acts, and because he doesn't say this explicitly, but also because it would be the kind of job that people of his economic position who were African American would have been expected to do by kind of wealthy white people. And what I want to suggest is that this we talked about performativity in relation to gender and sexuality, but the kind of performances that we see Jason narrating himself as having done are structured by the economy and structured by his race and the ways in which these things interact. So we have this quote from the shorter piece that I uploaded to eCampus, where Melissa Anderson says, "Real life itself demands performance, artifice, and mediation." So artifice is pretending to be something. So yeah, real life demands performance, and it demands performance from people who have to perform the act of being happy in their job, for example. People who have to perform the act of being good servants. And the sense that realness of being then is not a static concept any more than race, sexuality, or identity are static. So the idea that someone is one thing all of the time is perhaps illusory, but something that we see in Portrait of Jason, or something that I want to draw our attention to in Portrait of Jason, is the way in which the kinds of performances that Jason does, are, at least that he narrates himself as having done in his life, are structured by and related to what he needs to do for money, which essentially is a relationship to property, and it's a relationship to race, because it's a relationship to what people like him would have been expected to do. So again, we can see this in a moment early on in the film, again, where he talks about talks about one of the people that he used to work for. And there's a sense, Jason is describing a performance in the past that he had to do in his job, but he's also performing it for the audience now, and he's performing it in a way which perhaps allows him to, again, create this self of Jason Holiday, this person who has done these things and who has worked these jobs and who has encountered the kinds of people that he's talking about encountering. So we'll watch this bit.
Dress with lampshades made like the dress and draperies, and it was plaid taffeta, and it was a one-room apartment on East 64th Street, and she was always dashing madly, and I'd be in the house doing nothing, like sitting on my behind, reading the magazine, or eating up all the lobster, eating up all the snails, and the minute I hear her coming, I'd get busy, and she'd enter and say, "Jason, has Edgar been here? Fix me some of my chicken." They always want chicken, because they know all color folks know how to fix chicken. I'll be in the kitchen frying my ass off, "Yes, Miss Howard." She hadn't been married in 20 years. We're still calling her Mrs., And this man is like, boom, boom, boom. So then one day she said to me, "Jason," she said, "we're going to have a little party." And I was in the kitchen doing all the work. And I said, "Oh, no." I said, "Miss Howard, I don't want to come out and talk with the guests." You always say that, but you probably got all the guests' phone numbers. You tell them, no, you don't want to really mix, because, you're there at work. Oh, they say, "Come on out." She said, "Well, it's Halloween." She said, "You won't hurt anything." She said, "You'll be just another spook." I looked at this bitch and I smiled. I said, "Yes, I'll be right out." Then I came out and I had my drink, Then you take your humble position back again. And then one of them said to me once, she said, "Jason, I never really much liked niggas, and you're the first one I ever really cared for." And I said, "Oh, that's very sweet of you." I said, "Well, then I should have this position a long time." Oh, I go back in the kitchen. I said, "Was she dropped dead?"
So, again, the performance is working on at least two levels. We have this description of Jason being very aware of the way in which his race is structuring his interactions with these people for whom he's working. It's structuring his capacity to do the job. So he has to know how to make chicken, because wealthy white people assume that all African American men eat chicken. So he makes chicken because this woman wants him to. And he's kind of paraded in front of her party because he's an African American man. Also, one can presume he's quite a camp African American man, who again would be something that the people who would come to this woman's party are not used to seeing. At the same time, we hear her use the N-word, or we hear him reporting that she'd used the N-word, and he has to kind of accept it. He has to kind of laugh about it and say, "Oh, well, if I'm the only N-word that you've ever liked, then I should have the job for a long time." But we also see the way in which the job forces him to push these feelings down of antagonism and probably, of anger and hatred, and to say, "Oh, I wish she dropped dead." And all of that is then wrapped up within a kind of performance that he is giving for Shirley Clarke, about himself and about the history of Jason Holiday. And again, if we read Gustafson, we read that he is that Jason is doing this almost as a screen test, is the frame that Gustafson wants to give the whole film of Portrait of Jason. And Jason is creating a self which he himself hopes to be able to sell within the film in order to get access to a nightclub act. So we see these layers of performance. We see a performance based on race, and we see a performance of Jason himself within the film performing the way that he used to previously perform, in order to try and get something. And I have said this before, but I'll say it again. I think that, performativity within Portrait of Jason, and I think within lots of people's lives, I think we can follow Butler in saying that gender is more about the actions that you do than it is about some kind of internal core that you have in your person. And we can read Lemmy and Miller, and we can say that homosexuality and queerness has only been a kind of identity for the last 100 years, 150 years, maybe 200, maybe 180, 200 years. But when we say that, we also need to understand that performativity itself is structured by economic position and by the ways in which class and the ways in which race necessitate certain performances rather than others. And all of this is wrapped up in the way in which we see Jason talking about his previous life and the way in which his previous life demanded that he behaves in certain ways rather than others. And again, we hear several stories in the film about the ways in which his performance of race and also his performance of queerness, or his queerness and his race, which is manifested in certain performances, interact with his relationship to certain features of society. So we hear a story in which he talks about his interactions with police, which I'll draw attention, which we'll watch now. We're probably not going to have time to watch the drag performances, which are obviously an important part of the film. But I'll talk about them briefly. But I think we'll watch this bit. And he says, "I find when the heat gets to you," and the heat is the police. It's a slang word for the cops. So what if the heat gets to you? William Burroughs' Naked Lunch, Burroughs was a queer white writer from around the same time as this. It opens with the line, "I can feel the heat closing in," but it's the cops. And he talks about how performing gayness or like emphasizing his queerness has a kind of social function here.
Gets to you. It's one good escape from being gay. I was grabbed one time, they're gonna search you, As soon as the cop touched me, I went, "Oh, office." And I was cool, I tipped away with my thing, and I found out not to hang around there anymore. But that's a good thing. Sometimes it saves you, it really can save you. Go into a thing. I've also found, I hang out with a lot of Ofays.
So we see the way in which I think that moment is interesting because it emphasizes two things. It emphasizes Jason as someone who, essentially, because he's a working class African American person, then as now, is the subject of more and more police attention than would be given to a middle or upper class white person. That's just historically true, and it was true in 1967, and it's still true in most places in the world. But we also see the way in which his sexuality intersects with this. And again, he's using, and again, the other thing we see is the way in which he uses this story as a way of demonstrating his own cunning and as a way of demonstrating his own capacity to get out of difficult situations by revealing the fact that he's a queer man in a way which, because the police are homophobic, kind of saves him. And at other points in the film, we see the way in which Jason, as a working class man who doesn't possess property and who kind of moves from job to job, he comes into situations in which his queerness and in which his sexuality is very heavily policed, and he narrates situations in which he has been, in which the fact of not having property, the fact of being objectively poor, and again interacts with his queerness and determines how his sexuality can be expressed and be not expressed. So, for example, we hear this narrative of him staying at a YMCA in Los Angeles.
Well, I being, the respectable type, I always stayed where I thought it was the most safe. And, there's nothing like a good round Y or even a square Y for that matter,
So the Y is the YMCA, which is a hostel / youth homeless shelter, basically. It's where people with very little money would be able to stay. Some of them would have been free, some of them would have been not free. And again, this relates to queerness too, because as I'm sure you guys know, there's homelessness and not having a place to stay then as now disproportionately affects queer people, queer young people, gender non-conforming people, because they often, not always, but often find themselves unable to exist within the family structure which they have. So if someone is kicked out of a family home, if someone is ejected from the family home, or if someone is unable to remain in the family home as a result of their sexuality, and again, we won't have time to watch this, but we hear later on in the film about how Jason's father used to beat him because he was essentially, because of his sexuality, because of the acts that he would engage in, and because of the way that he moved or the way that he spoke and his kind of camp mannerisms. So we hear that Jason himself has come out of a very violent home situation, and although he kind of laughs about it in the film, it's not a happy story, but it's also not a story that would be unique amongst, queer young men and queer young women then as now, right? So, again, the fact that Jason is staying at a YMCA is something which relates to race, class, and gender. And he tells a story about how staying in these situations, again, results in his sexuality being policed in a particular way.
Of course, the Y's and all those other nice holy organizations, they're so holy, they got a policeman on every floor. If they hear two voices in a room, they'll kick the door down, Then you got to go through all this drag embarrassment of, get out of town or move into the other end of the city. It's a drag. Happened to me once. I wasn't in one place, so I give myself an hour because I was anxious that day. 5 minutes, I got back to my room. There was a note on the desk. You may have a refund. I sat there and I felt so bad. I was so shame. I said, oh God, how could I have been so stupid? Like after working a whole year to get there. I was there an hour. An hour. And I had to pack up all my shit and get out of there. And then I'm out in Olive and 9th Street in Los Angeles with a damn suitcase. I know where to go, but I said, I'll think of something. So I went and sat in a bus station. And one of them big, robust-looking construction worker type cats came along, and I got in his nose. And I talked this cat to death. Next thing I knew, I was in an old jalopy heading for North Hollywood. Me in North Hollywood. I said, oh, I must send some postcards. And so I went to North Hollywood with this child. That's what he was, an overgrown child, all muscle, no brain.
And then he kind of talks about the way in which he essentially becomes like a servant and a mother for this construction worker who he persuades to pick him up after he's been kicked out of the YMCA. Again, something which is interesting about this story, or something which I think the story expresses, is the extent to which the story that Jason is telling about his life, or the stories that he's telling about his life, bring him into contact with the ways in which sexuality and the ways in which queer identity are policed in the society that he's grown up. So he's essentially leaves an abusive father who is unable to deal with his sexuality. He talks about how he would deliberately antagonize his father as well. He talks about how he would deliberately make his father angry, knowing that he would be beaten, but he would still refuse to kind of pretend with his father that he was someone that he wasn't. And then we also hear stories in which he moves around, and in which the kinds of performances that he does are structured according to very basic economic necessity. He gets kicked out of the YMCA because he has sex with a man within an hour of getting there, and then he has to immediately make himself acceptable to this kind of construction worker who takes him to Hollywood. And that's where a new stage of his life begins, and that's where a new kind of performance begins. And all of this is encapsulated within the kind of performance that we see him doing in the film itself, in which he is creating or narrating a kind of self in real time. So the final bit that we'll focus on is the nightclub act, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the elements of that, and then we'll wrap up for the day.
A lady, and my favorite lady from Hollywood was Miss Mae West, and Mae was like, a way out chick. I think she's really a female faggot, but she's cool. And I'd like to give you a few lines of Mae's from some of her, more famous productions. I remember once she said to Victor McLagan, she says, you may not be no oil painting, but you're a fascinating monster. So she was in a show called Diamond Lil, and they did a nude of her with a little piece of chemise over her body. So she said, say, Jim, did my painting come back? He said, yes, Lil, it's in there. She said, well, I'd like to take a look at it. I want to see if they got all my details in place. So she looks at the picture, and there she is, gorgeous. So she says, say, Jim, where are you going to put that picture? He said, oh, I don't know, Lil. We're going to hang it up around here someplace. She said, hang it any place you like, as long as you don't hang it over the free lunch counter. Oh, yeah, Sylvia Sims said to her, says, Lil, I'm going right down to Macy's and get you that watch. She said, get me no watches, baby. I'll have nothing to do with time. She had a nice, big, brown, dark-skinned maid named Beulah. She was laying back in her bedroom one day, and she said, Beulah, peel me a grape. She told W.C. Fields in the flick one night, she says, after the honeymoon, she puts a goat in the bed. She says, now you just lay there, Lammy boy. Everything is going to be all right as long as you keep your mouth shut. Fields is in the tub going, oh, my, hurry, little fella, isn't it? She's up on the hill meeting some cat. He jumps off a horse bandit style, gives her a pot of gold, big kiss, jumps on the horse, splits. She stands there daggling the bag of gold, and she says, farewell, my quickest one.
Right?
Lovely hat. Nobody can wear these big hats except May and me. Wow. If my mother could see me now. Guess who? Scarlett O'Hara. Tara, what's happened to Tara? No food. Oh, with God as my witness, I shall never be hungry again.
Okay, so there's a citation, and first of all, we should note the fact that when he performs Scarlett O'Hara here, he's performing a scene from Gone with the Wind, which is I don't know if anyone's ever seen it, but it's a extremely racist film about the influence of the Civil War on Southern life, especially kind of the Southern American aristocracy and kind of what happened to them after the end of slavery and after the Civil War. But it's very much a tragedy about how hard it was being white when all of your slaves are free. So there's a kind of deliberate irony in the fact that Jason is performing this role of this woman who is the central character in a film, again, about the decline of property after slavery. But there's also kind of critical readings of the where are we? Of the ways in which he performs himself and the ways in which he performs these roles, which again suggests to us that it's almost like he's failing, and it's almost like he's deliberately failing in a way which emphasizes both that he's able to take control of the narrative that he's giving and that he's doing. He's able to pretend to be these people in a way which parodies them, but which also emphasizes the fact that these performances are not are being done out of a kind of necessity, and that he can't inhabit these roles that he's trying to inhabit. So we can say that there's a tension between the way in which he performs a kind of parody. I'm going to write this down so it's clear because I feel like I'm getting lost. There's a tension between the kind of parody that he does of his performance and the way in which he is obviously incapable of fully inhabiting or inhabiting the role of a white Southern aristocrat. So I think that this does two things. It on the one hand, it emphasizes the fact that Jason is able to perform in a way which unsettles these kind of static selves, this idea that, we get this clear sense that everything is a performance of a performance of a performance, and when he's performing his nightclub act, this is parodying white culture, it's parodying like the most famous Hollywood movies, and in some sense there's something emancipatory about that. But at the same time, we also know that he's doing it for economic reasons. We know that he is approaching the film as a way to try to set himself up with a kind of job that we know that he would need. So the whole thing, essentially, I'm going to keep coming back to this, but this idea that that there is a lot of performativity in this film, and in some ways this is a film which enables Jason to perform a self and to create a self through performance. But the kinds of performance that he does and the kind of performances that he can do are structured by his position. And again, I'll end with this quotation from Gavin Butts, which I think is kind of interesting. I'm not sure that I totally agree with it, but he says something that Portrait of Jason does is that it does not offer acceptable positive images of minoritarian identity. So we don't get the sense that Portrait of Jason is trying to integrate someone like Jason or trying to make him acceptable. He's queer, he's a sex worker, he's unapologetically those things. And it does not try to give a kind of moral judgment on Jason, but reads this as a positive element. And at the same time, it doesn't essentialize Jason's quality of being African American. So it doesn't present him as someone whose qualities are totally deducible from his race. It doesn't present him as having a kind of black identity. If anything, it shows the ways in which his identity is fluid. It shows the ways in which he's capable of creating an identity for himself. And there are tensions in this between the ways in which he is, we could say, exoticized. So he is made into an object of study. Or an object of study by the film, at the same time that he is also unapologetically queer, unapologetically African American, and unapologetically not like the stereotype of an African American heterosexual man, and also not like the stereotype of a well-mannered, well-behaved integrationist person who is morally good and who is unambiguous and who will just kind of, happily go about their day. We see that he has played those roles, but we also see that those roles were precisely a performance which emerged out of a kind of economic necessity. Okay, guys, I feel as if this was a little bit garbled today. I'm sorry about that. Garbled means a bit of a mess. But I hope that you got some interesting ideas out of it. I hope that you have... there's a lot more that we can say about this film, and there's actually a lot more that I was planning to say about this film, but the time has run out. So I hope that you enjoyed it. The exercise for this week is just to write a 1 or 2 paragraph response to the film. What do you think it's about? Did you find it funny, interesting, sad, morally unacceptable, or all of that? Try to answer within the paragraphs who is in control of the film. Is Clarke in control? We talked about some of the ways in which her editorial influence has a strong impact, even though she claims to just be filming. Or is it Holliday who's in control? And are there points in which this slips or changes? And if so, where are they? Maybe an extra question could be... sorry, those are my notes. An extra question might be, is the film a queer film? Is it a film about a queer person? What might be the difference between these two? So... yeah, And again, you can send those to me, or you can post them on the forum. It would be nice to have some conversation on the forum, but obviously I understand that not everyone is up for that, so don't worry about it too much. And yeah, have a great week, guys. I will speak to you next week when we will be talking about John Wieners. You have the extracts. I know that I said that I would post a full outline for the course by now, and I'll do that at the weekend. COVID keeps on reminding me that I'm still very tired, so I've been slower than I would like to be. But I hope you're getting something out of this anyway. And yeah, okay. Speak to you next week. Ciao.